Hello! Though I've covered many of the arguments against the expanded universe that are brought up here in this article before in the past on my channel, and many times over, many of my viewers and subs have requested that I make a response. And I have been meaning to, but I haven't had the time to do a detailed response, nor the energy to do it until now. My friend Yukaphile and I did record a response to this over a year ago, but the audio on his end wasn't recorded, unfortunately. It was just my voice in the audio. So I'll just be tackling this on my own. After several months of writing a script and research, here you go. A few years ago, I came across the writer of this article, Force Wave's YouTube channel in this case. He did a video basically damage controlling for The Last Jedi, and his argument was basically, "You thought TLJ Luke was bad. Look at what Legends did with Luke in Dark Empire." The funny thing is, a few months later, The Rise of Skywalker came out, and did the same thing Dark Empire did, and brought Palpatine back with cloning, making his argument kinda null and void. In addition to this, if Force Wave had actually read Dark Empire, Luke is not really ruined. Luke Skywalker overcame what happened in Dark Empire, and went on to rebuild the Jedi Order, something he didn't succeed to do in TLJ. Another thing he brought up in the video is that George Lucas supposedly didn't consider the expanded universe canon because Matharla quote.
Impressive. Every word in that sentence was wrong.
Plus other taken out of context quotes people love to use. I got into an argument with Force Wave in the comment section of the video he made, and it went nowhere. Like the typical Starlog quote humper, as I like to call them, he just plugged his ears and went, "No, no, 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 no. My Starlog quote dropped, so I'm right, you're wrong in the story." A year or so later, in August 2019, he comes out with his article, and I see many expanded universe haters constantly copy and paste a link to it, and using the article like it's a definitive argument against expanded universe fans when debating its canonicity. But in reality, this article is incredibly poorly written, biased, and follows all the logical fail tropes I've seen with EU haters, including cherry-picking specific quotes, ignoring others, outright denying evidence, taking quotes out of context, misinterpreting them, poor overall research, and using every excuse possible to try and bash and discredit Legends. The article does start off great, and briefly discusses the history and the importance of the impact of the Star Wars Expanded Universe on the franchise. Force Wave at the end also says that whether a story is canon or not should have no bearing on your enjoyment of the material. And I agree with this, because I still enjoy the EU even though it's no longer canon, and there are a handful of many stories in the new canon timeline I'll admit I think are actually pretty good. At this point, I really don't care about the current canonicity of a story. All that really matters now is if a story is good, and if a story from canon is good, and it could fit in Legends with no contradictions or just minor retcons, that could be fixed with headcanon, I basically consider as part of one of my personal headcanon timelines, and I've kind of adopted that way of thinking from hanging out with Luke and Todd from the Scoundrels Cantina, so I will give Force Wave credit on some of that. However, his next statements and arguments, in between what he says at the beginning and the end, is where it all goes downhill from here. Force Wave's first argument is he brings up the announcement about the Expanded Universe's decanonization from StarWars.com in 2014, and he basically claims, well, they never actually said the EU was decanonized in the article. All they simply did was finally, after all these years, clarify that it never was in the first place. And they finally acknowledged and enforcing George's opinion all along that it never was.
Amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
And what I'm sitting back and wondering is, why did they discontinue existing storylines in the Expanded Universe if they were non-canon? He brings up the part of the article where they claim TCW and the movies were supposedly always the only definitive canon. I'll deal with this statement later on. Another question is, if the movies in TCW were the only ever canon, then why did they keep a specific EU story? Dark Horse Comics' Son of Dathomir as part of the canon reset back in 2014. It also makes me wonder why they didn't keep the other TCW tie-in media canon as well. They don't even mention Son of Dathomir in the article, but it was still canon to Lucasfilm after this article announcement. I heard rumors that it was based off of unfinished TCW Season 6 and 7 arcs, but it still makes me wonder, why is Son of Dathomir also counted as Legends too? In addition to this, why is TCW also considered officially a part of Legends as well as canon timelines by Lucasfilm, if it was supposedly the only thing besides the movies that was ever canon? Going on, while it is true the word decanonization is never used in the article, the funny thing is, much like the typical EU hater who loves to cherry-pick specific quotes, Forcewave ignores something that is said later on at the very bottom of the EU Turns a New Page article from StarWars.com. On screen, the first new canon to appear will be Star Wars Rebels. The EU was never canon in the first place, then why do they feel the need to even mention the notion or existence of a new canon? In both Legends and canon, there is a New Republic. If there was a New Republic, what does that imply? There was an Old Republic. If they are mentioning the existence of a new canon, then what existed before that? Explain this to me. Can you also really take this article seriously when Lucasfilm outright lies and pretends like their non-movie Star Wars material was never overseen? I'll showcase it was overseen in some quotes I'll bring up later. In addition to this, Lucasfilm claims everything will be on the same level of canon, but years later, Leland Chee states there is no truth to the universe.
Or anything.
Well, because there's no such thing as truth. Like, things that we assumed as truth, 4LM is a, bounty hunter that's not a robot, all of a sudden changes, so, like, anything is malleable.
Forcewave then goes on to claim that George Lucas is rarely quoted when it comes to the discussion about the Expanded Universe's canonicity, and paints this supposed end-all, be-all, holy grail quote like it's some obscure quote nobody uses or knows about. This is not true at all. The Starlog quote, and some of the others he brings up, which I'll talk about in a moment, is the most commonly used quote to try and debate the EU's canonicity. You can look up arguments all over the internet around the time the EU was axed, and it was used everywhere, even till today. It's not some obscure thing. Forcewave then goes on to dismiss the quote from the Splinter of the Mind's Eye reprint from 1994, where Lucas outright says the Expanded Universe is part of his saga. Just because it doesn't agree with Forcewave's own agenda and the Starlog quote somehow outranks it. I'll get to the Splinter quote from George Lucas later on. and how the Starlog quote doesn't necessarily override it. But now on to the Starlog quote itself. Now, I won't read it because I think everyone knows this overused quote and what it says. But at first glance, it does seem like Lucas is saying the expanded universe isn't canon. And believe me, back in 2014 when I first saw the quote posted everywhere over and over again online by EU haters trashing the EU, I was deceived into thinking so too. But here's the thing. If we look back at your statement and argument at the beginning of this of, well, they never actually said the EU was no longer canon, the StarWars.com announcement. Your same logic used there can be applied to the Starlog magazine quote. Not once does George Lucas ever use the word canon, nor even directly refer to the expanded universe as non-canonical. In the Starlog magazine quote, you haters and the anti-Legends crowd automatically see George use the words different world or two worlds and come to the conclusion that this literally means the EU was never canon. Well, not necessarily at all. This quote is so misinterpreted by people. When George uses the words, it is not literal like they interpret. I read the entirety of the Starlog issue 337 interview, and George Lucas brings up something very interesting in regards to what he writes for the movies, what he says, and the crazy prequel haters that overanalyze his intentions and bash his works. But I think it could apply to all you Starlog quote humpers who misinterpret George's words. Well, first of all, it's a metaphor. You can't take this stuff literally. People take documents and make them literal. And there are whole institutions built up to try and tell you what a particular document means, what each word means, what was intended. Our whole system of law is based on that. It gets down to the point where you have to say, hey, you can argue about what's written on the page, but that isn't what the issue. The issue is what's the intention. Sounds exactly what you Starlog quote humpers do when you hump that cherry-picked Starlog quote to death, huh? Speaking of you cherry-picking quotes, and not doing any further research beyond a few measly quotes you bring up in your article, I found a few quotes you conveniently left out from George Lucas. In an interview with TheForce.net in 2002, George Lucas is asked about the offshoot material, and his wording is quite interesting if you examine it closely. Do you supervise the development of all the off-movie stories? After all, Star Wars exists in books, comics. You know, I try not to think about that. I have my own world of movies and I follow it. Of course that the people who expand this universe work for me, but I can't follow up all that they produce. While this quote could be used to try and say George Lucas wasn't that involved in the EU, which is something I'm going to address later, George implies that with so much stuff being produced, he doesn't have time to oversee everything at every second. Back to my point. If we examine George's wording, he says he has his world, which metaphorically refers to his stories he creates, the films, and not a literal different world. George then says, of course, that the people who expand this universe work for me. Notice how George says, this universe, not that universe, when talking about the expanded universe, expanding the universe of Star Wars. If you have any understanding of of the English language, we use the word this to talk about things near us, and we use that to talk about things away from us. By using the term this, he is talking about something singular, and not something away from what he is talking about. And George is talking about the Star Wars universe. Lucas doesn't use the plural these either. So George isn't talking about there being two literal Star Wars universes that are literally separate from each other, but one singular universe. Let's examine George Lucas's wording again in another interview, but this time with E! Online in 1999. Do you have a map of this universe? Every single creature? Where they come from? What they eat? What their society back home is like? Or are you just making it up as you go? Well, I think somewhere in some of the dark recesses of my company's files, there is something like that, but I've never seen it. And I don't really know, even though I live this and I know the worlds very well. And I know what everything in them is. Half the time I'm in the fortunate position to just make it up. So when somebody asks me a question, I know what the consistencies are. I know what is consistent with a particular environment and what isn't. And really that's the job of the director, to keep everything in line. I can do that on the movie, but I can't do that in the Star Wars universe. He says the Star Wars universe, not a Star Wars universe, or the Star Wars universes. If you understand the English language, once again, the word the is a definite article, and it's used to refer to something specific, not a set of things. By using the definite article the as in the Star Wars universe, and saying universe instead of universes, he is referring to one universe. It's also interesting to note that while he claims he hasn't seen some sort of guide that catalogs the universe, it's very interesting to note that we see George has something like that here in front of him on display, which suggests he has read it. George Lucas was asked by John Knoll about Anakin's scar and how he got it, and Lucas basically says that it's something that happens in the expanded universe and that the EU has to fill in the gaps for him. So how did Anakin get the scar, George? I don't know, ask Howard. That's one of those things that happens in the novels between the movies. I just put it there. He has to explain how it got there. I think Anakin got it slipping in the bathtub. But of course, he's not going to tell anybody that. Those who have read the Clone Wars Multimedia Project would know that Ventress gave Anakin the scar. Now I've seen some people take the last part of this quote where George says he slipped in the bathtub and got the scar, take it literally, and try to use it against Expanded Universe fans, but here's the thing. If you read between the lines, Lucas is obviously being sarcastic and joking about the bathtub thing. And why would Lucas say the EU has to explain something for him if it wasn't canon to him, Force Wave? Explain. You have to be able to read between the lines and examine George's wording carefully. And look at more than just a few scant statements from Lucas like you bring up. But I bet you'll just dismiss the quotes I brought up and continue to hold on to your Starlog quote as the definitive end-all be-all proof. Which makes me ask the question, just why do you think your beloved Starlog magazine quote is the end-all be-all piece of evidence? And why doesn't any of other Lucas's statements, like the ones I bring up, count to you? What makes it somehow outrank other quotes from Lucas, like the ones I just showed, and the Splinter of the Mind's Eye reprint quote? It's just cherry-picking because they don't agree with your agenda. Another quote you denied and dismissed because it doesn't agree with your agenda was Leland Chee's response to when Star Wars fans asked Lucasfilm about the Starlog magazine quote directly, and it was confirmed and clarified that the expanded universe was not separate from George's vision of Star Wars. And this was on StarWars.com, December 7th, in 2005. George Lucas is certainly not bound by the EU, though he's certainly open to using things created in it. Aayla Secura and the Coruscant name, for example. On the other hand, the quote you provide makes it sound like the expanded universe is separate from George's vision of the Star Wars universe. It is not. The EU must follow certain tenets set by George through the films and other guidelines that he provides outside of the films. Leland Chee is speaking for George here, may I add. George can't respond to statements like that from fans because he's a busy man, so his company is speaking on his behalf. And I must note, George never directly said Leland Chee was wrong here, too, either. So anyways, if George isn't saying the expanded universe isn't canon, or his use of the words different world and universe isn't literal, then what is George Lucas actually saying? Like I said, I believe it is more metaphorical than literal. I've got a quote from Sue Rustroni from Lucas Licensing from StarWars.com on June 2004. He knows the comics very well. After the fact, he reads the comics. George knows more about Star Wars than we do. He doesn't see the expanded universe as his Star Wars, but as ours. I think this has been mentioned previously, maybe in other places, but it's not new info as far as I remember. The movies, as I've said, are Lucas's Star Wars stories, and everything else, the expanded universe, I'm going to include TCW as part of that too. I know you'll argue it isn't, but I'll get to that later on. Are his company's Star Wars stories. Makes sense, since he directly made the movies himself, while his company produced everything mostly on their own, but with Lucas's oversight. And with that, I'll go more into that later on, but let's bring up the second quote you try and use to prove Legends wasn't ever canon before I continue my point. This is from the Cinescape magazine, I believe, July 2001. There are two worlds here. There is my world, which is the movies, and there's this other world that has been created, which I say is the parallel universe, the licensing world of the books, games, and comic books. In the next quote you provide, it again looks like George is saying Legends wasn't canon at a first glance. But once again, George Lucas does not specifically refer to the EU as non-canonical, nor does he even use the term canon. So it's hard to use this and the Starlog quote as proof the expanded universe supposedly was never canon, when he never directly refers to it as such. All you anti-Legends people and EU was never canon supporters immediately see George use the term parallel universe and assume he is referring to canon, or is saying the expanded universe isn't canon and that it's an alternate universe. Well, there is actually a big difference between the terms parallel and alternate universe. Just like the Starlog magazine quote, this quote you bring up was shown to Lucasfilm, and Leland Chee once again clarified it and stated the EU does not go in different directions from the films. And this was on StarWars.com, January 2005. Parallel universe suggests that each universe can go in separate directions, which really isn't the case with regards to the EU. The EU is bound by what is seen in the most current version of the films, and by directives from George Lucas. So there you go, it's confirmed. Once again, you can't just dismiss statements from people in his company because they are speaking on his behalf. Tad Larkin on his secondary channel, Captain Fordo, has an interesting take on that second quote you try and bring up. And he has a very interesting point on the term parallel that is used.
Next big misconception and counter-argument that the anti-EU/Legends people like to throw around is that George Lucas never considered the expanded universe canon. More specifically, it's this exact quote that they throw around. There's my world, which is the movies, and there's this other world that has been created, which is the parallel universe, the licensing world of books, games, and comic books. The anti-EU/Legends people see the word parallel and immediately think that parallel means separate, therefore the EU was an alternate universe and doesn't matter. Let's take a second to analyze the word parallel. Being a CAD draftsman by profession with a background in architecture and engineering, when I think of parallel, I see two lines, side by side, always equidistant from one another, not intruding on one another, but still projecting toward the same endpoint. And this is analogous to what George is actually saying here. He's saying that the books, comics, and TV shows work in tandem with his universe and don't intrude on it, his universe being the 6 Star Wars films. He even goes on to explain, they don't intrude on my world, which is a select period in time, but they do intrude between the movies. And this is why George did not allow expanded universe authors to publish media taking place in the prequel era before he even had a chance to make the prequels in the early 90s. Even if George Lucas had come out and directly said, yeah, that stuff, oh, that was never canon. I just authorized those officially licensed books, comics, video games, and TV shows because I want more money and don't care about world building at all. The fact of the matter is, he is no longer involved in the franchise anymore, and whatever his feelings were, don't matter anymore. I'm thoroughly confused as to why fans of the new canon use this to attack the EU, as if it justifies the new canon's existence, when George Lucas isn't even involved with their canon at all. Disney threw out his story treatments for Episode 7, and threw out 37 years of continuity based on his approval and guidance, as I'll explain later.
Going back to what Subaru Stoney said earlier about his versus ours, when referring to the movies and the expanded universe, and connecting that all together, George could be talking about parallel in terms of production line and the spin-off material being created. The EU is being made alongside, parallel with George's creation. The movies and this material is Lucasfilm's Star Wars, because the company is making the material themselves. In another quote somewhere, where George Lucas talks about the 3 pillars of Star Wars, he mentions the licensing world. The spin-off material his company creates as one of the 3 pillars of Star Wars. George even compares it to the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. If you are a Christian like me, or just have a basic understanding of Christian theology, you would know that the Trinity represents 3 aspects of the same thing. But in the end, they are one. The other 2 pillars being the stories he created himself, which are the movies and the movies alone. And the last pillar is the fan creation. He also mentions and makes references to a licensing world in the parallel quote you bring up. So once again, Lucas isn't referring to a literal different parallel, alternate different world or universe. The different universe and world and the licensing world, like I said, refers to the Lucas licensing branch of his company, Lucasfilm, and the material his company creates. And being a supposed alternate different world or universe is metaphorical. So those 2 quotes you provided that supposedly prove Legends was never canon don't necessarily overwrite or contradict the quote where Lucas says the EU is part of his saga. So yes, George is still saying the EU is canon since he states it's part of his saga, and the saga is the 6 movies. Speaking of this quote, you never specifically read out the whole thing of what it says. So I will. In the 1994 reprint of Splinter of the Mind's Eye, George Lucas says, "After Star Wars was released, it became apparent that my story, however many films it took to tell, was one of only thousands that could be told about the characters who inhabit its galaxy. But these were not stories I was destined to tell. Instead, they would spring from the imagination of other writers, inspired by the glimpse of a galaxy that Star Wars provided. Today, it is an amazing, if unexpected, legacy of Star Wars that so many gifted writers are contributing new stories to the saga." However, another thing George is actually saying in the two quotes you provided is while the EU is canon, as he states in the Splinter of the Mind's Eye quote you just dismiss, the films are more canon than the expanded universe and all other material in the Star Wars universe. Did you forget about the hierarchy of canon? Because you never bring it up once. And it's almost as if you're purposely leaving it out of your article so casuals will be fooled by your agenda. That, or you're just plain ignorant because of your poor, shallow research. The hierarchy of canon system used by Lucasfilm during those days supports my statements. Before I go on, I'll go over what the old system was and how it worked. In the old hierarchy system, we had G-canon, which was just the movies themselves. Then there was T-canon, which was just TCW. C-canon was the majority of the expanded universe, including most of the books, the comics, and the general story part of the video games. Strangely enough, the Ewok movies, cartoons, the Droids cartoon, too, the 2003 Clone Wars microseries were considered C-canon and not T-canon. Going on, S-canon was the gameplay footage and the mechanics of the video games. Certain older materials, or material in general that doesn't quite fit in continuity with the other stuff, but could have had aspects of the story still happen. It's not exactly the way the story depicted things. And then there was N-canon, which was material that was strictly non-canon, such as Infinity's branded stuff. Star Wars Tales, or stuff like Tag and Bink. Makes me wonder something, Forcewave. What was the point of the Infinity's brand if the EU was never canon to begin with? And notice, under the hierarchy system, the expanded universe is not listed as being N-canon, nor was the majority of the expanded universe classified as Infinities. If it was not canon to begin with, there would be no point in making a C-canon separate from N-canon. So don't try and bring up the argument that since it wasn't G-canon, that it meant that it was never canon at all, because I could use the same logic for TCW then, since that wasn't designated G-canon. Some people even mistakenly believe the different canon tiers represented different timelines, literal separate canons, or continuities, which is a big myth. On the StarWars.com forums in the early 2000s, Leland Chi was asked, a clarification is needed if the C and G canon level are separated, i.e. do they form independent canon, or are they both part of the overall continuity? Leland Chi responded back by saying there is one overall continuity. I know you'll say something like, well, the hierarchy of canon didn't apply to George, that was just something his company only used. You got evidence for that? Because George's statements you try and use as evidence to discredit the expanded universe actually line up quite well with how canon worked. The films being absolute alpha canon, and everything else, the expanded universe and TCW, basically being beta canon. Less weight, but still official canon, even if the movies still have the most canonical weight and precedence out of all the Star Wars material. Back to the Splinter of the Mind's Eye quote. Still, I mean, you could argue back to me, well, George never said the word canon in the Splinter reprint quote either. Well, I guess Lucas never even brought up the subject of canon when it came to Star Wars, ever, by that logic then. So I guess I can just end the argument and the video here if I wanted to, and the case is settled. But I want to continue to tear apart your awful article. Since you seem to love quotes from George Lucas and think it automatically overwrites everything said by everyone else, I've got a quote for you. Force Wave, if you think George was saying the expanded universe wasn't canon in the Starlog magazine quote, then you have to give TCW the same exact treatment as the EU. On MTV.com in 2008, George Lucas said, "In the end, the movie, and by extension, 100-episode TV show for which serves as a prologue, is not a Skywalker story. The epic itself is about one man. You pass through a lot of things, but you never get to look at it. With Clone Wars, we're not burdened by the mythological underpinnings. We get to go more places. The story about Anakin Skywalker and his fall to the dark side and redemption by his son, that's finished. It was started when he was 10, it ends when he died. There's no more story to tell. All that stuff is really not a part of what this is. Stylistically and tonally, however, the film almost takes place in an entirely separate universe." George here says TCW isn't a Skywalker story, and that the Skywalker story is not part of what TCW is, and that TCW is almost part of a separate universe. Similar wording to your beloved Starlog quote. On Collider.com, in an interview in 2008, Lucas was asked if TCW and the eventually but sadly cancelled Underworld show would be canon. A lot of people have been talking about online that the new Clone Wars cartoon and the new live-action show are actually going to be considered official canon in the Star Wars universe. What, real stuff. Is that true? Well, there's the... We say there's the three pillars of Star Wars. One is, the features and the films, and what I do. That comes from me. And then there's the licensing, which are the books, and the comics, and the things which come from a bunch of other people. And then there's the fans, who make their own stories and create their own Star Wars world. So these three visions of Star Wars are all out there, and they don't always mesh, but they always feed on each other. Notice how George Lucas does not include or mention TCW as being part of the first pillar, which is the films. You bring up quotes from Filoni to try and prove the EU wasn't ever canon, but I found quotes where Filoni basically admits the EU was canon in Star Wars Insider issue 115. Did you draw on any expanded universe sources when you were developing them for the show?
Not particularly. There were only a few scant things that George and I actually used in the Clone Wars series itself. That's not to say the other EU stuff is eliminated or gone. I know some people will say, this isn't the way I pictured it, but we're showing a particular point in their history, which is a very interesting development point. When I play games like Knights of the Old Republic, there are Mandalorians in them. All that history is still there. We're just looking at one slice of it at this particular moment. It's bound to be different from some other people's ideas.
Read between the lines and examine Filoni's words. He says, that's not to say the other EU stuff is eliminated or gone. And when I play games like Knights of the Old Republic that have Mandalorians in them, all that history is still there. How can something not be eliminated or gone, or history still be there, if it was never canon to begin with, according to your logic, and what Filoni later claims? After all, you can't eliminate something or have history still existing if it was supposedly never canon in the first place, right? In Insider issue 140, Filoni mentions connectivity between TCW and Star Wars The Old Republic, the MMO.
I put nice little clues in there
Referring to the Ilum Caves.
for fans, people playing the Old Republic, to see some connectivity between the game and the history we've created.
What's the point of having connectivity between the two if SWTOR was never canon in the first place? You bring up a Pablo Hidalgo quote from the Essential Reader's Companion to try and prove the EU wasn't ever canon, but if you wouldn't cherry pick things, and if you would have gone through the entire book, Pablo Hidalgo later contradicts himself and admits that the expanded universe was canon when he says the 501st first became a part of official canon when it was mentioned in the Legends novel Survivor's Quest. Survivor's Quest was the first official Star Wars work to use the 501st Legion name. The 501st began in 1997 as a fan organization of stormtrooper and Imperial costumers, and has been a mainstay at Star Wars sci-fi and comic book conventions. Members are lauded by Lucasfilm for their charitable work, particularly with children's hospitals. Author Timothy Zahn had met fans from the 501st on his many book tours and convention appearances, and honored them by including them as part of the Star Wars canon. So it doesn't matter what Filoni, Chi, or Pablo Hidalgo says about TCW being the only canon thing besides the movies to Lucas in the quotes you provided in the article. George says TCW isn't canon either, just like your beloved Starlog magazine quote. According to your logic, George's words outrank everyone else's, right? And before you say, well, you're just misinterpreting the quotes and twisting them, George never says TCW isn't canon in those quotes. And you're not doing the same thing with those two quotes you people like to hump, where Lucas never specifically refers to anything being non-canon, nor uses the term? All that aside, we all know George isn't actually saying TCW or the expanded universe isn't canon in the Starlog quote, the Cinescape interview, or the two quotes I just brought up. Much like the Starlog quote about the EU and the MTV.com quote, Lucas is actually saying TCW is not on the same level of canon as his movies. The old canon hierarchy system I brought up earlier supports this. If it supposedly was on the same level of canon to George as his movies as Filoni and Pablo claim it was, it would have been listed as G-canon. But it's not. It's clearly designated as T-canon. T-canon is not on the same level of canon as G-canon. I know you bring up a quote where George says he doesn't distinguish between the movies and TCW in your article, but here's the problem. George doesn't clearly specify in what way he doesn't distinguish between the two. He never specifically says in terms of canon, and never uses the word in that quote. And while he could be saying that, what he says about distinguishing between the two could be interpreted in many different ways. Is he talking about visually? Aesthetically? Tone? So it technically wouldn't overwrite the MTV.com quote or the Collider.com quotes I provided. So in conclusion to what I was saying, George says TCW is not on the same level of canonicity to the movies, just like the expanded universe was. But it didn't mean both were not canon at all. So it doesn't matter what that StarWars.com quote at the start of your article said, what Dave Filoni, Leland Chi, or Pablo Hidalgo said in that quote. Doesn't what George Lucas say automatically outrank everything and everyone? I'm just using your own logic here, dude. Next, Force Wave uses the classic argument of, well, George ignored and overwrote things the expanded universe established, so therefore that means it wasn't ever canon. So what? It's George's universe. He's the creator, and he can change whatever he wants to, whenever he wants to. He even changed his own movies with the special editions. Greedo shooting first, anyone? George Lucas even changed a few things the original trilogy established when the prequels came out. Obi-Wan says,
For over 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic.
while Palpatine says in Attack of the Clones,
I will not let this republic that has stood for 1,000 years be split in two.
a generation is a span of many years, not a singular year. And typically a generation is 25 to 30 years long. And 1,000 generations would mean the Republic is more than 1,000 years old. So Lucas making changes doesn't automatically make the entirety of the expanded universe not canon. As an example of something Lucas ignored, Force Wave brings up an old contradiction that no longer exists anymore in continuity. I'm honestly shocked you didn't bring up the classic Boba Fett Jaster Muriel contradiction that EU haters love to parrot over and over again to death. So anyways, Force Wave brings up the Republic fighting clones in the Clone Wars. Oh yeah, Force Wave? You mean these separatist clones right here that the Republic forces, Jedi, and clone troopers together are fighting? Even then, if you've read the Thrawn trilogy, Timothy Zahn still kept details about the Clone Wars quite vague, as George Lucas still wasn't sure if he was still going to make a prequel trilogy yet in the early 90s. Even if George ignored or changed a few things, on the other hand, there are a few things he acknowledged in the prequels. For example, Lucas literally referenced the EU in Revenge of the Sith multiple times.
You owe me one, and not for saving your skin for the 10th time.
9th time. That business on Cato Nemoidia doesn't count.
This scene right here is a reference to Labyrinth of Evil. And that was an event that happened at the start of the Labyrinth of Evil novel.
In short, Seleucumai has fallen. Master Voss has moved his troops to Bos Pitti.
This scene is a reference to the Battle of Seleucumai, which is from the Republic comics, as well as Star Wars' obsession with the Battle of Bos Pitti. In Revenge of the Sith, in Palpatine's office, there is an art mural in the background during the scene where Palpatine reveals he's a Sith to Anakin. In the Revenge of the Sith visual dictionary, it confirms that this piece of art is a depiction of a battle of one of the ancient Sith wars between the Jedi and Sith. A wall panel in the office depicts a legendary battle between the Sith and the Jedi. Revenge of the Sith Visual Dictionary 2005. It's rumored that this was a battle in the Great Hyperspace War, or one of the battles on the planet Ruusan during the new Sith Wars period. So before you bring up that quote where George claims that there were never any wars between the Jedi and Sith, what he says in that quote doesn't matter, because he intended that art mural to be of a Jedi and Sith war directly in the movie. Then wars like that did happen in universe. Actions speak louder than words. So even if he ignored a few things, on the other hand, there are plenty he acknowledged. Force Wave then brings up a bad example for George supposedly contradicting the EU. He used the classic Dave Filoni argument of,
Oh, it was George. Without George's fault. Blame George for the retcons, not me.
That brings me to my next point. George's involvement in TCW. A lot of people make a big deal about George Lucas's involvement in TCW and act like it was so special, while downplaying his involvement in Legends. But if you actually look at the details and examine it, Lucas's involvement in TCW was literally no different than what he had been doing with the expanded universe, despite what you try and use with Leland Cheese statements. Now, I'm not trying to say this to downplay, bash, or discredit TCW in any way, because I'm a fan of the show. I grew up with it. I have nostalgia for it. TCW, like the Thrawn trilogy, kept Star Wars alive after the prequel trilogy ended. And it's a pretty decent show on its own. So anyways, back to George Lucas's involvement in TCW. Since you love to cherry pick quotes from Lucas and think it automatically overwrites what anything from anyone else from Lucasfilm says, here is what George himself on EW.com has to say about his own involvement in TCW. No, I mean, I'm doing it just for fun now. You know, I'm an executive producer now. I don't do the day-to-day work. I check in once a week, maybe, and it'll be the same thing on the live-action show. Lucas admits himself here that he doesn't do the actual day-to-day work on TCW, and that he checks in once in a while to check in and oversee things. Lucas only checking in and looking at mostly others doing the work supports the idea of TCW being part of the metaphorical, parallel different world that is the Lucas licensing branch of Lucasfilm. And that second pillar George brings up, basically. And George, it also admits, he's just an executive producer. So just what is an executive producer? An executive producer is the head producer who supervises other producers in the creation of a film, television show, web series, commercial, or theater performance. They make work independently or on behalf of a studio, financiers, or the distributors. They will ensure the film is complete on time, within budget, and to artistic and technical standards. Bottom line, an executive producer is usually a financier of the project. Typically, they'll assemble the core team, but will not physically produce the project. George Lucas also had this to say on the BBC.com in 2005. No, it's more like having your kids go off to college. They still come back when they need money. They'll be there for holidays. We're doing a couple of TV series. I'm not really involved with it. One is an animated series about the Clone Wars. All the characters are in it, but obviously there's not much character on it. And one is a live-action series about minor characters in the saga. So it's still going to be around. I'm going off and doing my own thing. The company is going off and doing theirs. But the comic books, novels, and games that are out there are going to have a life of their own. So it's sort of like sending the kids off to college. Now it's on its own, doing its own thing. I just reserved the theatrical arena for this saga, which I say started out as a 2-hour idea and turned into a 12-hour story. Since you also like Filoni quotes, I think it's the only gospel source besides Lucas. I've got a quote from Filoni about Lucas selling Lucasfilm and retiring. From Star Wars Insider, issue 137.
To us, his retirement means he has more time to watch the show. I always tell him I don't believe he's gonna retire. When he stops showing up, I'll believe him. But he's taught me to make all these decisions without him.
You read between the lines, the first part about having more time to watch the show implies that George Lucas actually hasn't watched too much of the final product of TCW, much like a lot of the other non-movie stuff, well, the exception of maybe the comics. And that goes back to when George Lucas said he doesn't have time for every single thing his company creates. Filoni then says George has taught him to make decisions without Lucas, implying less involvement. Rob Coleman, who worked with George Lucas on the prequels in Star Wars Insider issue 107, even admits that TCW was primarily Filoni's show. So you knew what to expect? Yes. But I was trying to find a balance. This is Dave Filoni's show. Just an interesting observation I wanted to bring up. Dave Filoni claims that George Lucas didn't like the vibroblade being able to block a lightsaber, and had them change it to the Darksaber lightsaber, while forgetting about the Frike electrostaffs in Revenge of the Sith. This makes me question a few things. If Lucas was that heavily involved in TCW to the degree people overly exaggerate, wouldn't he be seeing all the times we see our heroes like Anakin, Ahsoka, Obi-Wan, Koth, and more engage the IG series Magna Guards with the electrostaffs? Why didn't George say anything about that? It makes me question how much he actually did see. So yes, George Lucas did oversee TCW, and he funded it right out of his pocket. But he did not directly write or direct a single episode of the series directly himself. Filoni even admits Lucas did not direct a single episode of TCW, and expresses his desire to see Lucas do it in Star Wars Insider issue 128. Would you like to see George direct an episode?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that would be something. It has briefly come up in the past. You know, with George, I would say nothing is out of bounds. If George came in and said, Dave, I want to direct an episode, I'm not going to say, well, I'll see if I can fit you in. That would be a treat not just for the fans, but everyone at Lucasfilm Animation.
Filoni in Insider 104 was asked about how often George came in. Is George Lucas involved on a day-to-day basis? Or does he look at the episodes and then comment on them?
Well, he comes up with story ideas and presents them, and then we form the script. And it's really like a series of check-ins that we have with him. Sometimes pretty often. He's a really busy guy, so I'm very happy when we get his time. He's always available to me in the editorial stage. I come up with ideas, and George comes to me with ideas.
Also, look directly at the credits of the show at the end of each episode. You'll see, besides executive producer, there is no other credits from George Lucas. Speaking of writing things, George actually did write a few expanded universe things, such as the prologue to the Mace Windu novel Shatterpoint by Matthew Stover. Lucas was also heavily involved and wrote stuff for the Ewok TV movies in the mid-1980s. Not only that, but Lucas also directed the reshoots for the Ewok movies himself.
After principal photography, there was 1 week of reshoots. Corti was unavailable due to prior commitments, so Lucas himself stepped in and directed parts of the shoots uncredited.
He had more of a hands-on involvement in these movies than a lot of people know. When we had to do the 1 week reshoot to do all the retakes later in August, he actually directed all the reshoots. So I actually got directed by George Lucas, which was a pleasure and an honor.
After production was complete, Lucas and Smith oversaw the post-production, which utilised many Star Wars veterans.
So you could argue that George was maybe just slightly more involved in the expanded universe, since here he is actually physically writing and directing some stuff in it. It's interesting how it's claimed that TCW was kept for Lucasfilm's new canon because of George's involvement. But if that was the case, then why are the 2 Ewok movies not part of Lucasfilm's new canon? Especially since he was more involved in those than he was with TCW. George Lucas did sit down and talk with Filoni and crew about the show. Check yes and no on stuff, suggest ideas for it, some of which were ignored by Filoni. But guess what? This is the exact same thing he did with the Expanded Universe authors, comic writers, and LucasArts game developers. No difference. In an interview with George Lucas and Alan Dean Foster about Splinter of the Mind's Eye, in Star Wars Insider issues 145 and 146 from 2013, we see and have George Lucas sitting down with Alan Dean Foster and discussing the book. We see George is sitting down with with the author in the exact same way he was sitting down with Filoni and crew. Granted, I won't read out the entire interview since it's long and spans 2 Insider issues, but I'll post a few screenshots to read, but my point still stands. George Lucas had a hand in many of the things in the Tales of the Jedi comics from the early 90s, specifically about the Sith. And this was in the letter to the editor column in June 1997 from one of the comics. The specific issue was Tales of the Jedi Fall of the Sith Empire #1. Sorry you didn't like the framework of the Sith and Dark Jedi, Chris. But that background came directly to us from George Lucas. We're following his guidelines and building a story within the parameters he himself laid down. It may not match with your ideas, but this is George's universe, and he gets to establish the rules. We just try to tell the best story we can within them. It's interesting how a lot of things in Tales of the Jedi were from George himself, and that Tales of the Jedi talks about history and wars, and depicts wars between the Jedi and Sith. But George supposedly says there weren't any such wars, even though this stuff directly came from him in Tales of the Jedi. One of the most notable examples of Lucas's involvement within the expanded universe was the story of The Force Unleashed. In Star Wars Insider issue 97, the story that Hayden and George Lucas came up with was a proper screenplay. In Star Wars Insider issue number 93, The Force Unleashed is the official next chapter in the core Star Wars saga, with more story input from George Lucas than any previous game. On TheWire.com, on August 2008, in an interview with Leland Shee, the Keeper of the Holocron, Lucas approves every important addition to the canon. The ambitious story beats contained in the new game, The Force Unleashed, were permitted only after he signed off and spent hours talking to the developers about the relationship between Darth Vader and the Emperor. The first quote here implies that George came up with some of the story we see in TFU, and this interview I showed confirms it. You can also look at the developer behind the scenes of The Force Unleashed as well.
Back in the summer of 2004, we knew that we wanted to start working on a next generation Star Wars game, and with a galaxy as deep and as large as Star Wars, the opportunities are almost endless. We would go and we would just watch the movies and then get back together and say, okay, what types of characters did we like? What types of things really resonated for us? What are the things that were referenced that haven't been explored yet that we want to explore? So it was actually, we didn't have a shortage of ideas, it was whittling down to the right idea. ranging from a Wookiee freedom fighter. We looked at games centered around some of the main characters, so a Darth Maul game, for example.
Some we were more intrigued with than others, but nonetheless, we really wanted to get input from George.
He laid out that there were things that you had to hit in a Star Wars story, that you had to have adventure, that you had to have humor. And then we show him the next presentation is this Wookiee game, and he looks at it and he goes, so I just spent 45 minutes talking to you about the importance of drama, and you present me a game concept where the main character doesn't talk? So he wasn't a big fan of the Wookiee game, but he understood what we were going for in terms of a superhero type character in the Star Wars universe. A lot of the early Star Wars concepts revolved around gadgets and tricked out spaceships.
But it just got outside the realm of what really felt organic to Star Wars and the brand of Star Wars and the canon. The Jedi's already a superhero. I mean, he already has powers, but what if we not expanded those powers in the sense of adding new powers or gave him an entirely different slant, but what if we took the existing stable of powers and reimagined them?
Well, what if we really jacked it up? What if we unleashed it and delivered a Force experience that people hadn't seen before? Why it worked for us and why that was the direction we wanted to head is because it was the one that made you feel the coolest and the most powerful. And from a game perspective, moving to next gen, oh my goodness, you know, when you've got the power of the 360 and the PS3 at your fingertips, suddenly you can actually pay off on that unleashed feeling in a way that you couldn't do before.
George is all about, you know, fundamental gameplay, and so immediately when he saw that, that was what we were going to do.
He allowed us to give Darth Vader a secret apprentice, which from a canon standpoint is just fantastic. It is such a rich character opportunity. He's got a great love interest in Juno Eclipse, so it's not just blowing things up and unleashing the Force on everyone, it's the consequences of those actions as seen through the eyes of Juno. So that gives an emotional weight that's crucial to delivering a Star Wars experience. Those are elements that George always made sure we were hitting, and if we came up short on one of them, he didn't hesitate in pointing them out.
We could bounce ideas off of him. He could tell us, nah, I wouldn't go there, but did you ever think about this? Or, hey, why don't you create this new character, which was fantastic, because all of a sudden that opened up the canon for us.
For the look of it, I like where the tech is mixed in with the old. Yeah.
The team did an amazing job in doing a lot of art up front for what this game could be.
Good concept art for me is the beginning. It unlocks, it unleashes creativity, so to speak, where you see things, you know, a great artist gets in there and paints in little details that you hadn't thought about. Oh, what if we do this or what if we do that? And they just went crazy and did, you know, dozens of these really short play blasts, which are really simple animations. And then from there, we were able to select a handful to take the kind of final previs quality, and that's when we created that previs.
What or who created this kind of a mess?
When we all kind of took a look at it, it was one of those moments where, yeah, that's it. That's the game we want to make. That would rock.
That video was incredibly important because it got all of us excited about, yeah, this is something that's going to be a great game. We were able to show it to George, and he was, yep, that's it, go make that. But as Hayden likes to point out, the scary part was, once he said yes, oh my God, we had to go deliver on that, and that's what we've been doing the last couple of years.
The basic premise, Hayden speaks to this all the time, and he makes us all say it in every meeting. You know, what's the premise of the game? Kicking someone's ass with the Force.
What is the core gameplay?
Kicking someone's ass with the Force. Once we had that core foundation, we also could go off and begin to write a wonderful Star Wars story.
It is a rich, deep Star Wars story that fits right in the continuity between Episode 3 and Episode 4.
The galaxy is on the brink of darkness. The evil galactic empire has overthrown the old republic and now holds countless worlds in the grip of fear.
Because of George's schedule, we had to actually put the story and the outline in a memo form to George.
It was a day when, you know, we heard that the fax was coming and everybody rushed around the fax machine.
And we just stood there looking at the fax machine waiting for it to come out.
And the pages start coming through and then the machine jammed and we're, you're running to get new paper and fix it. And you know, so we actually have this great crumpled fax that came through that we, you know, got and put together.
And you could immediately see that he had checked off basically yes, 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 all the way through, added a couple of great comments.
Bail Organa did this, and Leia was doing this, and it's like, oh my God, you know, this is the absolute source material for this great saga. For me, it was awesome to be able to take that fax in hand and go back to the team who had worked so hard on this, for over a year, and be able to say, this is it, guys. This is our story. This is our character. This is the use of the Force that we're championing. Let's go. Let's hit the ground and make this game. The time between episodes 3 and 4 is an incredibly fertile time, and George encouraged us to develop new characters to tell new stories. Characters at the heart of everything George has done with Star Wars, and it's certainly at the heart of The Force Unleashed. The main character in The Force Unleashed is this character of Darth Vader's secret apprentice. He's almost this primal character that has these incredible Force powers and uses them in highly destructive means. That's how he's been trained by Darth Vader.
No Jedi in history has ever used the Force in the way that this guy uses the Force. Vader has sort of experimented with this kid to see how far you could take it. And he's taking it to the limit. He's taking it as far as it can go. He's a Force wrecking ball. He's unstoppable.
George was very big on make sure you have a love interest, make sure you have a Jedi mentor, make sure you have a comic sidekick. Hayden worked really hard in coming up with new and unique characters that also fit very familiar archetypes within the Star Wars universe. The cast for Star Wars The Force Unleashed is composed of what we call the Big Five. There's the Secret Apprentice, and that's the character you play in the game.
You will never convince me to betray my master.
Then there's Juno Eclipse, who's the love interest, and she's a very proper Imperial pilot who ferries the apprentice around the galaxy.
My orders are clear. Keep your ship running and take you wherever your missions require.
There's General Coda, who is a hard-boiled Jedi Master that kind of develops a relationship with the apprentice and becomes the apprentice's kind of new mentor figure.
Months of attacking Imperial targets, and Vader sends a boy to fight me.
There's Proxy, who's the droid's sidekick, and he brings some comedy to the story. And then, of course, there's Darth Vader, who is the apprentice's master, and it's his plot and his schemes that are propelling a lot of the story forward. We had many conversations with George Lucas about Darth Vader and what is going on in his mind and his heart during this time period.
I am your father.
The relationship between Vader and the apprentice is definitely, absolutely father and son. We sort of decided that the apprentice is kind of like a dark Luke Skywalker.
Join me.
This is what would have happened to Luke Skywalker had he joined Vader.
With our combined strength.
This is how Luke would have been trained. This is what Luke would have been like.
I'll never join you!
Vader's a horrible father figure. He can't be a good father. His goals are so at odds with nurturing somebody. He wants to drive this kid to the dark side.
And so Vader's been torturing this kid from an early age. And in terms of this kid's morality, he doesn't know which way is up.
We knew that the character was going to have had a hard existence, a hard childhood and adolescence, that he wasn't going to be able to relate well to other people outside of Vader and kind of his droid sidekick. So when he first starts interacting with Juno, for example, the apprentice has no idea how to handle it.
Captain Juno Eclipse, born on Korrilag, where she became the youngest student ever accepted into the Imperial Academy.
When the apprentice first bumps into Juno, when he first meets her, there's kind of a fun playground dynamic where he's taking Proxy aside. He's like, "Who's that? Like, what? Oh my God, don't tell her that I like her. Shh. Here, pass this note."
Is there a psychological profile in there too?
When developing The Secret Apprentice, we really wanted to look at a character that the player could inhabit, a character that had a personality that was somebody that you wanted to be, that you aspired to be in the game. So we really wanted to advance the technology of storytelling and character development through character performances. So we have true character performances in our game using full-on image capture and motion capture technologies that were pioneered at Industrial Light and Magic. So we really had to cast an actor that could act not just using their voice, but also with their face.
We're in this room, we're surrounded by these cameras at first, and I was really scared that they were just going to sit you down in a chair and be like, "Okay, we're going to put dots in your face. Okay, now act."
We have all these little tiny reflective white spheres on the face in different positions. And those cameras know exactly where every one of those little dots lives in that 3D space. And when they turn or they change position, the camera tracks that information, and that way we know exactly how our character's moving, and we have all that data.
Was that okay for...
It's like acting from the shoulders up, and you're trying to give all of this drama to it, and you're basically shooting it just like you would a film.
One of the many things that really sets us apart is our collaboration with ILM. ILM has a suite of tools and technologies that they call the Clone Cam, which enable them to capture 3D data at a fidelity higher than anyone else. We're leveraging that expertise, we're actually using those tools, we're using that facility to generate all this data. And when we have that, the quality bar goes through the roof.
There are things that we've never really seen before in a game from kind of a character performance standpoint, and I think that's just going to draw players in. The only note from that scene was the, what is your bidding, my master, is just the, we talked about this last time too, just putting a little more venom on that.
On my master?
Yeah, on the my master part. What we tried to do is tell a story that helps close some of those gaps between episodes 3 and 4.
Particularly with The Force Unleashed, the character arc is incredibly strong because the theme of The Force Unleashed is redemption. And in fact, the place that they end up makes these characters so pivotal in the Star Wars saga that once you place these characters between the first trilogy and the second trilogy, you can't imagine Star Wars ever again without them.
And let's not forget about George's involvement in the original 2003 Clone Wars microseries as well.
Are a major event in the history of the Star Wars universe. And obviously because it's a war, there's a lot of action and a lot of adventure and a lot of things going on. But in the films, we don't really get to deal with that very much. We kind of start the Clone War in one episode, we end it in the next episode, but we never actually see the war. And so by doing the animated series, it was a great opportunity to fill in some of the blanks in the middle where you get to deal with the adventures of the war and all the things that went on during the war, because obviously that's a very fertile ground for exciting storytelling.
The response from the first 20 has been really positive. I think everybody just complained about how short they were. I got a phone call that George wanted to talk to me, and they had this idea because they wanted to do more, but he wanted it to tie in directly into episode 3.
It seemed like an honor, you know. He enjoyed the first batch enough to want to be like, hey, let's do some more, and not only that, let's watch you guys animate the opening scroll, basically. We're like, woohoo!
That's one of the great things about these. They're 12-minute episodes, and wow, we could fit 4 times, obviously, as much information, and plus it directly ties into the third movie, which makes it even more captivating because it's more of a story rather than just episodes of war. The big arc that we worked on was with the Anakin and Obi-Wan.
In our first batch, it was more of like what was going on in episode 2, with the kind of, you know, gruffy master and the kind of the, you know, bull-headed student.
You're supposed to be in space leading our forces. It's under control. Under control? I don't think so. Your place.
So we really wanted to show that there was a transfer of that, you know, that the relationship had become something a bit different. That those elements could still be there under the surface, but for the most part, you know, they're chums, they're pals.
And so if you like the first ones, these will be even stronger, because now we still have huge amounts of action, but we've got those little slower parts where you can have some great character relationships.
So it may start off like this, really thumbnails, totally.
You know, initially when we first started, we talked a lot about style and how's this going to translate into animation. But I'm definitely a very true fan of 2D traditional animation. You know, from Disney through Warner Brothers, through the Fleshers, through everything. You know, all the history that's established animation as an art form. And so it was kind of important to us to create a style where it spoke true of Star Wars and related to it, but it also had its own visual point of view.
The thing that attracted me to it has a slight anime feel to it, and I'm very interested in anime, and I was really interested in moving into a kind of animation that was very different from anything we'd done in the past. And Gindi is very good at bridging that transition between traditional animation and anime.
So here we are at Cartoon Network, and this is where we make Star Wars, Clone Wars. And as you can see, my room is a little messy, but I never have a chance to catch up and clean up. So the process that we're doing with the Clone Wars, the second chapter, is we're doing these kind of small thumbnails for storyboards. And this is actually some of the choreography. There's like 30, 40, 50 poses for like 5 seconds. Because when we do fights, we have to really do the choreography. And then what we'll do with this is we scan them into the computer, and then myself and a few other people will draw them actually on model. So here, if you can hear, so here, as you can see, here's the rough sketch that's blown up, and here we have our fielding. So that's kind of the pose I want to draw, and then so I'll draw the pose sometimes in different layers to come in. And then here underneath is I've got my whole storyboard of all the fight poses. So here we have Paul Rudish, who's the art director, and Paul's doing the same thing that I was showing you, except he's still drawing with a pencil and paper.
Having the opportunity to be involved with the whole Star Wars saga, it's been really cool to actually explore the Clone Wars. Me and my friend Mike Tweed be playing with our action figures and down in the basement and just, dreaming about what were the Clone Wars all about. And then having an opportunity to make some of that gel is really awesome. It's fun that there's so many different little mediums that explore Star Wars and making it a larger universe, and just on a nerd level, it'll be cool to go, yeah, my cartoon connects to that movie. Now you get to go see the movie and then find out how my cartoon ended. Pretty amazing.
One of the most important elements of Star Wars is all the flybys and how the ships go. And to do that hand-drawn would be very difficult. So that's kind of the only way the computer was involved, is by doing the animation on the ships. This is really my favorite part of the process, where we start seeing things coming together, and from those rough little thumbnails and even our ideas to this final process. And then once you add sound and music, it'll be even so much more spectacular.
The second group of episodes in the animated series leads right up to the events that happen in the film, so we get a little background on what was going on right before episode 3.
I mean, ideally what we'd love to see is we'd love to see like an hour edit of the chapters, the next 5, be shown in the movie theater right before the third movie, just to see how it feels, because it really does link up.
It's the last of this epic saga, and I mean, you gotta see it on the big screen.
Oh, there's a new one coming!
It's a little episode 2.5, but a little one, maybe like 2.3. Things that I really focused on from the first season to the second was I wanted it to feel like Star Wars. And so I really concerned myself with getting the feel right. Like, you're watching it and you forget that it's a cartoon, and you just believe that it's Anakin, it's Obi-Wan, it's Yoda. You believe those are the characters.
Initially with the first series, they originally were supposed to be commercials. Lucasfilm themselves, they decided that they would want to be a little longer, so they became longer episodes. But we weren't able to tell a lot of story. It was mostly just action. With the advent of the second series, we actually were able to tell an actual fairly long story. It was more like a movie, like an animated movie.
I mean, the thing about doing Star Wars is that it's the story. And the story coming from George, not just something we made up. And now going into this, all of a sudden, it's still Clone Wars, but it's the ending of the Clone Wars.
They wanted us to do more of what we had done because it was so successful, but at the same time they wanted us to actually do the crawl from the opening of the film. So it became more a real part of Star Wars. We had to show Palpatine being kidnapped. We had to have Anakin and Obi-Wan away from the planet and in the Outer Rim territories.
In our heads, we're already formulating what we want to see. Just by the nature of those few words, there's a big battle above Coruscant. And, you know, remnants of Return of the Jedi and what they pulled off in Return of the Jedi are still in your head and, you know, all that. So we got that chance to play with the Battle of Coruscant, and we started figuring out that what it is, it's just a big ruse. And we actually put that in the cartoon a little bit because we just couldn't wrap our heads around the fact that there'd be this big attack, but the temple is fine and the Senate is fine. So we kind of came up with this own thing. We have Mace and Yoda discover it.
Strange is the enemy strategy. A massive invasion, but no attempt to take the temple or Senate. Unless elaborate distraction to hide their primary objective. Palpatine.
Some of the look evolved very kind of naturally in order, and we got a lot of photographs and reference for what the new vehicles were going to be in Episode 3, and they were all hybrids between the TIE Fighter, between the X-Wing Fighter, and you could tell this is the bridging machinery. So we kind of followed along with that, and we made our clone troopers look similar to stormtroopers, and everything started to kind of fall into place, and everything starting to look like A New Hope. We wanted to almost treat it like one big 3-hour movie, including Revenge of the Sith and what we did. So we started to enhance all those parts in the movie that maybe you didn't have time for.
You're mine, old man.
We had certain goals in mind that we wanted to hit, like on certain people. We wanted to address the friendship between Anakin and Obi-Wan.
Since we know Episode 3 is their friendship has the big falling out, this is our last chance to let people know that they're pals.
In Episode 2, they were bickering, and, you know, you had your big brother, little brother squabbles.
We have a job to do!
I don't care! Put the ship down!
You will be expelled from the Jedi Order!
In Episode 3, the guys show up, and they're good pals, and they're joking around.
I sense a trap. Next move? Spring the trap.
Of course, in Episode 4, old Ben is telling Luke about when he and Luke's dad used to be old pals.
You fought in the Clone Wars?
Yes. I was once a Jedi Knight, the same as your father.
Just those few sentences created such a mystique, you know, in your brain as a kid going, oh man, what was it like when Luke's dad was cool and Ben was young and they were hanging out and swashbuckling around the universe and the Clone Wars? What the heck was that about? Not everything needs to be totally explained, but definitely knighthood wanted to be explained. That pinnacle moment in Anakin's evolution.
Anakin Skywalker, by the right of the Council, by the will of the Force, dub thee I do, Jedi, Knight of the Republic.
We thought, oh, let's give him the knighthood, but then he's going to have his trials after. And we got excited about that idea, and then we started to structure our story based on that theme. Okay, what situation are we going to put Anakin in that could be like a trial? What George Lucas always says, it's all about mirrors and kind of like ripples, and the ripples repeat themselves. So we wanted to follow that thing where on Dagobah in Empire Strikes Back, where Luke steps into the cave and he sees Darth Vader, and, you know, and whatever vision that gave him.
When Anakin went into the cave and had his vision, it's kind of like his final trial. It's kind of like a roadmap saying, well, this is what's happened on this planet, and this is what's happening in your life, and they kind of mirror each other, but at the same time, he takes something else from it. He comes away thinking that his actions could hurt Padme, and I think that strengthens his feelings in the third film, because that's a main point in the third film, that he is concerned with her life. And when we show that in the visual, that the cave drawing chokes like the little female Nelvon, where it's really just saying, you know, it's telling him that these are future events, but they're not set in stone, and that it's his choices that define who he is.
You really wanted it to be something original, and I really got excited about that, because here's something kind of new, and you really had a chance for our characters to shine.
General Grievous. You're shorter than I expected.
Jedi scum.
When we first did Grievous in Chapter 20, We had very little information about him. He was just being conceived as a main villain for episode 3. But for this, we had to really explore him more. And George kind of told me about, he had some thoughts about that he was like an old-style villain where he fights, but then when he's losing, he runs away. We had a lot of discussions about lightsabers. How does he know to use lightsabers? Because it's supposed to be like a special gift, and you're supposed to be force sensitive. George kind of told me, oh, well, maybe Count Dooku teaches him.
How often must I tell you? Control my central line. Good. I've been trained in your Jedi arts by Count Dooku.
And then we got a call that they wanted to introduce Grievous's cough earlier because our character didn't have it, so we somehow had to maybe link the two together better. And so eventually we ended up doing a little sequence at the maybe 2 weeks before we had to deliver of Mace going out and crushing Grievous's chest, and that's what gives us the connection that all of a sudden he starts coughing.
What's the situation, Captain?
A lot of Star Wars is about kind of reveals. And we got a chance to reveal a lot of things. And we even didn't think of it until we started doing it. We're like, oh, we get to reveal C-3PO's gold plating.
Gold plating? Oh, yes. In the service of a senator, one must be presentable.
Then we started to explore a little bit of the relationship between Obi-Wan and Commander Cody, where they have a relationship in the movie. So we kind of hinted at that a little bit.
General Kenobi.
Commander Cody.
The siege goes well. Oh, by the way, I think you'll be needing this. Thank you, Cody.
The one thing they really wanted to do is just draw Wookiees. As soon as we got approval that we could do something on Kashyyyk, we did.
We found out that what was going to happen in episode 3, Kashyyyk was going to be invaded, and so we need to get in there with some Wookiees because we know they're going to show up. It was exciting to have a chance to draw Wookiees because you love Wookiees.
Some of the most fun is to take something there's like a drawing in a book or one scene in the movie, and you create a whole world for that character.
Everyone out! No! We must pursue! General, we can't.
And the new ones that we did with Roran Cobb, where the race has 4 throats. And we're like, oh, 4 throats, that's a great idea. In our story meeting, we were riffing, and I go, all right, and then he's coming at him, and he just yells at him.
Thorians, 4 throats, quite powerful.
So I've heard.
Kenobi, Skywalker. Coruscant is under siege, and General Grievous has abducted the Supreme Chancellor. You must return immediately. You must rescue Palpatine.
Grievous. Battle stations. All crews to their fighters. Prepare to jump into hyperspace. Move!
Lock on to Martu. Master, General Grievous' ship is directly ahead. The one crawling with the vulture droids.
Oh, I see it. Oh, this is going to be easy.
I think some parts sunk together really well to episode 3. You can watch it from the beginning of our thing until they land the ship onto Coruscant. That can really feel like one movie.
Another happy landing.
When you actually sit back and you watch it when it's all finished and you look back on it now, you just think that it's a moment of pride.
It's very exciting to have been able to add a little bit to that mythology that sparked my imagination as a kid.
Everything we did, we based on original films, so how could we go wrong? It's going to feel like Star Wars.
I think Star Wars is, it's mythology. It's modern-day mythology that we all can relate to. It's very accessible because you see similar characters to people that you know or who you are inside. If you can create a universe and characters like that, that's what makes it last.
In August of 2009, Mixin Mojo had an interview with Mary Beer, LucasArts Vice President of Global Publishing, back in 2009. It's worth to highlight the following part from the interview. How much of a role does George Lucas have in the day-to-day activities of LucasArts? Tim Schafer once described him coming to visit the team while during the making of The Secret of Monkey Island in 1990, and offered his advice on the title. Was he involved in their decision to revisit it? Mary Beer? Definitely. George is involved at a high level with everything we do. He approves and gives feedback on all projects, concepts, and stories. George Lucas also had a hand in the early parts of the New Jedi Order book series in regards to Chewbacca's death and vetoing the Vong being dark side Force users. In an interview with Shelley Shapiro on December 2000 from Telling War Stories on StarWars.com, once we'd come up with a sketchy outline of where we wanted to go, start to finish, we had to get it approved from on high. For example, as I mentioned earlier, we were told we could not kill off certain characters. We originally intended the enemy to be Darkseid Force users. We were told they had to be non-Force users. We had a certain plan in mind for one of the characters. We were told to use a different character for this particular plan. That was about the extent of George's involvement. And of course, what Shelley Shapiro is referencing was the fact they either wanted to kill off Han or Luke, but he made them change it to Chewbacca. In an interview with John Seabrook, writer for The New Yorker, in January 6th of 1997, Lucas's day-to-day activities in the main house include the management of the Star Wars story, which is probably the most carefully tended secular story on Earth. Unlike Star Trek, which is a series of episodes connected by no central narrative, Star Wars is a single story, a finite, expanding universe. In the words of Tom Dupree, who edits the abandoned Star Wars novels on New York, everyone in the content-creating galaxy of Star Wars has a copy of the Bible, a burgeoning canonical document, currently 170 pages long, that is maintained by continuity editors Alan Kosh and Sue Rustoni. It is a chronology of all the events that have ever occurred in the Star Wars universe, in all the films, books, CD-ROMs, Nintendo games, comic books, and role-playing guides, and each medium is seamlessly coordinated with the others. In the same article, they later say, new developments in even the remotest corners of the Star Wars universe are always approved by Lucas himself. The continuity editors send him checklists of potential events, and Lucas checks yes or no. When Bantam wanted to do the backstory on Yoda, Dupree said, George said that was off limits because he wanted him to remain a mysterious character. But George has made available some time between the start of Episode 4, where Han is a young pilot on the planet Corellia, and the end of the prequel. So we're working with that now. From Bob Cooper on the editor for Dark Horse Comics Classic, letter to the editor section of the comic in April of 1993, be assured that nothing Star Wars related that Dark Horse publishes escapes the scrutiny of Mr. Lucas. From the director of content management of fan relations, Steve Sansweet on StarWars.com in November 2000, Lucas Books has always checked with the boss to make sure that none of his projects interferes in any way with anything that he is planning. And while plans can change, rest assured that the wonderful, expanded, fictional universe enjoyed by many fans has in no way stomped or trampled on any of George Lucas's prerogatives or options. In an interview with Tom Veitch in an article called Telling Tales with Dan Wallace for Star Wars Galaxy Magazine, issue 13, November 1997, rather than forbid us to get into those mysterious areas, it was decided that we should submit questionnaires to George Lucas. Basically, we would make up long lists of ideas we wanted to use, and he would check okay or not okay next to each idea. For example, I made a long list of possible powers that the ancient Jedi possessed. He vetoed most of them, but okayed some rather interesting ones, such as the ability to study the qualities of animals and acquire those qualities. He also okayed the use of Jedi battle meditation, the ability to influence events by interior visualization. And on StarWars.com, June 2004 with Sue Rustoni, or if we were developing backstory for a character he's created or mentioned in an interview, we can query him to get more information, his approval or whatever. And yes, we always query him if we're doing something drastic to a film character. I believe he does read the concepts for the games though. In an interview with James Lucino regarding the Plagueis novel, how closely did you work with Lucas licensing on Darth Plagueis? How much did George get involved? What advice did he give you? George was involved in the early stages. When the book was first proposed, I wrote to him and asked him whether there was any reason why Plagueis couldn't be a non-human. And he wrote back that Plagueis could be a Mun and sent me some artist renderings of the character. From that point on, everything was approved, as they're saying, at the highest level. I worked most closely with George's right-hand man at Lucas Licensing, Howard Rothman. It was a strange way to go about the book, because I kind of had to bypass both Del Rey and the usual editorial staff at Lucasfilm, and work directly with Howard over the course of what amounted to about a year of preparation. And in an interview with Matthew Stover on the Force.net, he says what's in the book is there because Mr. Lucas wanted it to be there. What's not in that book is not there because Mr. Lucas wanted it gone. Period. And on BusinessWeek.com in March 7th, 2013, still, Iger wanted to make sure that Lucas, who was used to controlling every aspect of Star Wars, from set design to lunchboxes, understood that Disney, not Lucasfilm, would have the final say over any future movies. So there you have it. Same exact level of involvement in TCW. That was no different. Sitting down and discussing the stories, checking yes and no on projects, and suggesting ideas. Same as TCW. So Leland Chee lying about George being mostly hands-off, like you try and bring up in your article, doesn't matter. Because we have multiple accounts of much more people saying the opposite. You go on to blame George Lucas for the retcons that happened between TCW and Legends, but he wasn't directly involved in physical writing or directing, as I proved earlier. So you can't really blame George for it. It was primarily Filoni and his crew. I mean, yes, you could argue that since George was acting as creative consultant, he supervised and that he approved of those things and story suggestions that retcon the EU. Like, I know you'll probably try and bring up the example of George supposedly not wanting Sith Force Ghosts when he vetoed against Revan and Darth Bane appearing as Force Ghosts. I don't see this as an example of George overriding the EU. Sorry. The dark side Force Ghosts that were in the EU were there because George allowed it. If he didn't like it, it would have never been allowed to happen in the expanded universe in the first place. I see it from a certain point of view, whether intentional or not, that George is actually protecting the continuity of the EU. Why do I say that? If Filoni was the supposed lore expert he claims to be, and he actually played KOTOR or read the Bane trilogy, he would have known having Bane or Revan as Darkseid ghosts would break EU lore. Huh. I brought up earlier that he claims to have played the KOTOR games, but I doubt it considering the amount of things he's gotten wrong. If he'd played KOTOR, then he'd know in the canon ending that Revan was ultimately redeemed. So it makes no sense for him to be a Sith Force Ghost. Filoni would have also known that Bane never learned to be a Force Ghost if he'd read the Bane trilogy. The deleted scene from the Mortis trilogy also makes no sense, because why would an ancient Force being who is eons older than the Sith themselves and supposed to be an absolute embodiment of the dark side turn to their teachings, or the Sith teachings? Being a Celestial, he should be viewing the Sith as beneath him, and as Kreia from KOTOR 2 would say,
children playing with toys.
Having this scene included in the show would have also ruined the great story arc that was the Mortis trilogy to a degree, in my opinion. Here is another thing. Dave Filoni has done quite a few things against George's wishes and vision with the series. For example, let's say for a moment that George actually did think Darkseid Force Ghosts were against his vision, as Filoni claims. I guess then, Filoni didn't do a good job of following George's vision then, because in a later season of TCW, we see Darkseid ghosts of the Night Sisters. So if it is true that George didn't want Darkseid Force ghosts, that means what Filoni did in that episode was against George's vision. I've heard the argument, what are those Darkseid Force ghosts? The Time Spirit. Same thing. That's what the majority of Darkseid ghosts, even in Legends, were. And don't try to tell me, well, George said the Night Sisters stuff isn't the Force of the Dark Side, so it's not the same as the Darkseid Force ghost. Well, not according to either Legends or canon. So I guess if George really did see the Night Sisters' abilities as separate from the dark side of the Force, then I guess Filoni wasn't following George's vision another way here. Another noteworthy and prime example of George's vision not being followed being when George wanted Ahsoka dead. But guess what? Dave Filoni and crew kept her alive against his wishes.
This was something that in the original discussion of the episode, we were just going to have her brought back into the Jedi at the end and be done with it, but I thought, well, we have an opportunity here to do something different. I don't think it's a mystery that I've always been a bit more in the Ahsoka Lives camp. And George has been very full on in the Ahsoka Dies camp. I think I've said that before, if not revelation for you. So I thought expelling her from the Jedi Order is a good movement towards that end. And we stand on that bold new frontier for her. You know, things have changed. She is not the same character.
I'm not against Ahsoka being alive after the prequels in TCW, by the way. Because we did get great further adventures of her in Rebels, and her confrontation with Darth Vader was one of the highlights of the Rebels series, in my opinion. But Filoni here himself admits he went against George's wishes and kept her alive. Another example is in Season 1. George did not think Plo Koon should be able to survive outside in the vacuum of space with just his mask on. And guess what Filoni did?
Plo Koon surviving in space. This was a hotly debated thing with my master, George.
Hey, what's a Jedi doing out here?
Yeah, he's like, what's that about? How can he survive in space? You know, to me it makes a lot of sense. He's an alien. I don't know what he can and can't do. It's not defined. If we say he can go out into space, then he can go out into space. George always made fun of us because he said, I made 6 films without having anybody fight in space. And I said, yeah, but Grievous got sucked out into space and then walked on the top of the cruiser. George is like, well, he's a robot. And I was like, no, he's not. He's a cyborg. And, you know, so it's fun to argue with George about those things. He gets into it.
He had Plo Koon go out in space anyways. Lucas, after a while, decreed that there can be no more Wookiee Jedi in Star Wars. In TCW, we see this mandate ignored with the inclusion of Gungi, who is a Wookiee Jedi initiate. And to be honest, I've really got no problem with the inclusion of Gungi as a Jedi in TCW, since I've got no problem with the idea of there being Wookiee Jedi. And I'm actually glad, you know, this and stuff like the High Republic materials, including them. Now, you could argue that George changed his mind, as he tends to flip-flop on things. But the EU never brought any more Wookiee Jedi after George ruled there to be no more, and followed the rule until the end in 2014, as far as I know. So I'm going to say this is another example of Filoni ignoring George's vision. These next 2 examples might not be the best, but Filoni claims that George supposedly thinks Jango Fett and Boba Fett were never Mandalorians, even though he would have approved of that in the expanded universe. And that's why, you know, we see TCW claim that Jango just stole the armor. But what does Filoni do? He goes back on George's supposed claim and makes the Mandalorian in the Mandalorian show. And another example would be, I guess if it really is true that George thought there were never any ancient wars between Jedi and Sith. Filoni didn't follow this vision very well, since we see remnants of a battle on Malachor in Rebels. Although those might not be the best examples, since you could argue that George isn't in charge anymore, so it wouldn't matter. Since you brought up George contradicting the expanded universe, let's bring up the examples of Filoni and his crew contradicting top-level Alpha G canon, the films. While I think the Clone Trooper arcs and episodes are some of the best stories to come out of TCW, their depiction in TCW still contradicts what was stated in the movies themselves about the clones.
They are totally obedient, taking any order without question. We modified their genetic structure to make them less independent than the original host.
So why do the clones need inhibitor chips if they've been conditioned to be loyal and follow orders no matter what? Another example would be in the original trilogy, Yularen was on the Death Star, and he was established as being an ISB colonel. But he's an admiral in TCW because Filoni, the supposed lore expert, thought he was a Grand Admiral. Anakin in Revenge of the Sith stated,
This time we will do it together. I was about to say that.
Yet help, you're no match for him. He's a Sith Lord.
Chancellor Palpatine, Sith Lords are our speciality.
Your swords, please. We don't want to make a mess of things in front of the Chancellor.
You won't get away this time, Dooku.
I've been looking forward to this.
My powers have doubled since the last time we met, Count.
Good. Twice the pride, double the fall.
implying the last time he and Obi-Wan fought was Geonosis. And the novel outright states it, and the novels themselves are considered G-canon too. More dialogue in Revenge of the Sith implies that Utapau was the first time Obi-Wan and Grievous have ever engaged in a duel with lightsaber.
Your move.
You fool! I've been trained in your Jedi arts by Count Dooku.
So with these examples in mind, how many other times has Dave Filoni gone against George's vision and lied, passing the blame on him? It's hard to say, but there could be more. So the blame game on George being responsible for all the retcons might not have much merit in the end. And in addition to this, with Filoni disobeying George's directives, using Dave Filoni as a source to discredit the expanded universe like you do is therefore questionable too. Next, Force Wave attempts to use another quote from George Lucas, where it appears he's saying the post-Return of the Jedi material didn't happen. In the quote, Lucas says, "Once Vader dies, he doesn't come back to life. The Emperor doesn't get cloned and Luke doesn't get married." In the quote Force Wave provides, George says Vader doesn't come back to life. And if you read the expanded universe, you know Vader never comes back in any of the stories. Interesting fact, they were originally going to resurrect Vader, or maybe an Vader imposter in Dark Empire, but George shot that down and made them change it, which proves my previous point of George's involvement in TCW being no different than the expanded universe even further. In an interview with Tom Veitch, the writer for Dark Empire, he confirms something incredibly interesting. Another interesting fact, generally unknown by the fans, is that Tim was asked to critique the Dark Empire plot, and I was asked to critique his book. This led to a spirited exchange which someday may see print. Tim hated the idea of the Emperor coming back, and probably wasn't aware that George Lucas had proposed the idea to us. And then later on, he's asked more about this in the interview. How did you come up with the idea of bringing back the Emperor? Tom, our original proposer was to bring back Vader's costume and mask. with somebody else inside it. We felt the Empire would need, or would want to maintain the fearsome image of Vader, and wouldn't much care who was wearing the armor and breathing them. George vetoed that idea, although he did allow us to have Vader appear in dreams and memories. He said, "No, you can't bring back the Vader costume. But if you can figure out how to bring back the Emperor, that's okay." Yes! Palpatine being cloned in Dark Empire was George's idea in the first place. So back to the quote you bring up. George is clearly talking about that if he wrote the stories after Return of the Jedi, he wouldn't have written those things, obviously. He's not saying they don't exist. He's just saying he wouldn't have come up with those ideas if he wrote the story. This is not to mention that Stackpole, I'll bring up the Stackpole interview later, in which confirmed that Luke getting married was approved by George and the Emperor being cloned was an idea George had for Veitch. Much like the Starlog quote you people abuse and hump to death, that quote you brought up is so overused and misinterpreted. It's honestly laughable. George Lucas said those things. The statement is not in dispute. That being said, it is also a reality that George Lucas is chaotic. Everyone knows this and can see it. I mean, this is the same guy who said Star Wars for little kids, but then he includes a scene like this. Remember when I brought up George changing his own movies with Han shooting second, and how old the Republic was? What he says and feels today is not going to be what he says and feels next week. What's canon today isn't necessarily what's canon tomorrow. So you could say what he feels is canon is always changing, like what Obi-Wan said. Depends on your point of view. You have to be able to read between the lines, which is something you are clearly incapable of doing, Force Wave. Leland Chee even stated on StarWars.com in 2006 that George's view on Star Wars outside of the movies is constantly changing. You're never going to know what George's view of the universe beyond the films at any given time is, because it is constantly evolving. And this is exactly why cherry picking and humping that Starlog magazine quote, the Cinescape quote, as the end-all be-all pieces of evidence, or any of George Lucas's words in general, and using them to discuss the canonicity of the EU, are not reliable as sources. Before you point out and tell me, well, you use quotes from Lucas in your response too. My point is, with using them, is I'm trying to build a narrative, use your own logic against you, and exposing what a cherry picker and how poorly researched your article is, since you only use and cling so tightly to just a few scant quotes compared to my far superior and much more comprehensive research. Force Wave then goes off on a random tangent that has nothing to do with the topic at hand, and uses a quote from Star Wars writer J.W. Rinsler, where he says that Mara Jade was hated by George Lucas. Okay, Force Wave, I have got one question for you. What does whether or not Lucas hated Mara Jade have anything at all to do with the topic of the expanded universe being canon or not? This is just a prime example of why this article is so poorly written and biased. When writing essays or articles, you don't go off on random tangents that have nothing to do with the topic or subject at hand. If you were writing an essay for a class, you get docked points for going off topic like that. That's also a prime example of how biased you are. It just shows how desperate you are to try and do everything and anything possible to discredit and bash the expanded universe. Also, in a recent interview, there is conflicting evidence that contradicts what J.W. Rinsler said. In a Star Wars Theory interview with Michael A. Stackpole, he stated that the whole thing about Lucas hating Mara Jade was just a false rumor.
So, long story short, I've always struggled with the overall rumor that George Lucas hates Mara Jade. Do you know where that got started? Is there factual data behind that? What's going on with that?
Is it true?
I think that's just a rumor that has kind of crawled up through fandom for years and years and years. I know that Tim met George Lucas. They had a sit-down conversation before the first book was done. I know that as with any of the novels, everything is cleared through Lucasfilm, and 100% for anything as major as a love interest being developed for Luke, that's a decision that George would have given a yes or no on. Okay, so I mean, Tim and I have talked about, and I've listened to Tim talk about the conversation that he had with George. I don't recall Mara Jade ever having been brought up specifically, but then again, you know, Tim, I don't have a readout of the that conversation. But it's also, especially in the early days of the internet, where you had message boards and people would leave theories and they would say this and that. There were things that were treated as fact by someone's supposition that just flat out weren't true.
So we've got two guys saying two different things about the same topic. Who's right here, Rinzler or Stackpole? Thing is, we'll never know 100%. Stackpole stated in the interview, along with many Lucasfilm employees and other interviews, that in the expanded universe, nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, in it was done without George's permission, sign-off, or approval. You would have seen that in the quotes posted in that list you just lazily dismissed, and the ones I brought up earlier. The character of Mara and her marrying Luke was done in the expanded universe because George approved of it. If you didn't want it or didn't like her, it would have never happened in the first place. So I'd side with Stackpole here. Actions like that speak louder than words to me. Which is a phrase I'm going to bring up again against your article later. Force Wave then goes on to use the rumors about what was in George Lucas's story treatments for a sequel trilogy, and how they were different from the expanded universe, with Darth Talon seducing Han and Leia's son to the dark side instead of Lumaya, to try and say it would have overwritten what was in the expanded universe, and thus this is evidence the post-Return of the Jedi stories were never canon. He also acts like George changed his mind about there being no sequel trilogy, and tries to suggest George would have made one himself, whether the sale to Disney happened or not. Here is the thing, Force Wave. You're presenting this as what George Lucas would have definitely have done with a sequel trilogy. But here's the problem. Those were just story treatments and concepts, not definitively what he would have done with a new trilogy, nor full-on completed scripts for any movies either. A film treatment or story treatment is a summary of ideas, not a full, complete movie script. I mean, look at George Lucas's original version of the OT. Those were just concepts that never made it into a final film or got changed drastically. Since you love quotes from George Lucas so much, in Star Wars Insider issue 138, Lucas himself admits that the treatments he had written are basically not full-on complete scripts or stories for a sequel trilogy. I just said I would back her up. I would be there, especially when it comes to helping with the script, making sure the scripts were okay. There are a lot of blank spots in the story treatments that hopefully we can fill in. A lot of blank spots that need to be filled in? That right there proves there was never a complete George Lucas sequel trilogy. Just a few ideas he had written down, and nothing more. Force Wave then tries to use Pablo Hidalgo on Twitter as a source to prove George would have not have used the EU and would have overwritten things. The funny thing is, Hidalgo specifically said on his Twitter not to believe anything he tweets or posts there. So, sorry, all the sources you use from Hidalgo's Twitter are automatically invalidated. And if you try to use more quotes from him on his Twitter page to try and discredit Legends, they don't count. I mean, the man himself says it clearly right here, am I right? So it doesn't matter if he makes those claims about George Lucas's supposed quote-unquote sequel trilogy. In the end, it doesn't matter anyways, because those ideas in the treatments, which were again just concepts, never full, complete scripts for movies, were not used and were thrown out by Lucasfilm. George is also adamant in the same insider interview that he'd never planned on doing a sequel trilogy, and it's clear there still wouldn't have been one even if he had never sold Lucasfilm to Disney. I always said I wasn't going to do any more. And that's true, because I'm not going to do them. But that doesn't mean I'm unwilling to turn it over to Kathleen to do more. I have story treatments of episodes 7, 8, and 9, and a bunch of other movies. And obviously we have hundreds of books and comics and everything you could possibly imagine. I moved that treasure trove of stories and various things to Kathleen, and I have complete confidence that she's going to take them and make great movies. One more interesting thing I want to point out. George also includes the books and comics, the expanded universe, alongside the treatments he mentioned, and he says he has confidence that she's going to take them and make great movies. He's including the EU as part of what he hopes is taken and used. It's almost as if he's, subtly acknowledging the expanded universe as canon here. Even years before this interview, he is still adamant about there being no sequels, and even stated he has no story for them. And all of that has already been covered by the expanded universe. And this was on an interview with the LA Times. There really isn't any story to tell. It's been covered in the books, and video games, and comic books, which are things I think are incredibly creative, but that I don't really have anything to do with other than being the person who built the sandbox they're playing in. We all know, of course, as I've demonstrated earlier, that George actually did have a lot to do with the EU. Even earlier than this quote, in 2004 on MTV.com, George reiterated, "There is no sequel trilogy once again. This was never planned as a 9-episode work. The media pounced when I made an offhand statement. It might be fun to come back when everyone's 80 and do another one of these, but I never had any intention of doing that." So in the end, a full-length, complete George Lucas sequel trilogy never truly existed. The sequels were only made by Disney and Kathleen Kennedy to capitalize on the acquisition of Lucasfilm and Star Wars. And what George had for his treatments were just incomplete concepts. I want to go back to the most overused cherry-picked quote used to debate the EU's canonicity again for a sec. In your oh-so-precious Starlog magazine quote, George Lucas himself even admits, "But I do try to keep it consistent." Why would George Lucas care so much about keeping it consistent with his stories if it was always supposedly non-canon to him? I mentioned earlier and brought up what George did with Dark Empire and how he stopped the writers from bringing back Darth Vader in some capacity, whether it was resurrecting from the dead or bringing in an imposter wearing his armor. Tell me one thing, Force Wave. According to your logic, isn't the expanded universe an alternate universe? Isn't all of it not part of his world of the movies? Isn't anything they do in Dark Empire non-canon and not matter in the end, since it's not part of the same universe as his movies? Why would George care if they brought back Vader, since Dark Empire would have been non-canon anyways, according to your logic? But George Lucas did care. Lucas stepped in and stopped them from doing this, and had them bring back Palpatine instead, In the Dark Horse Star Wars Republic comics, the writers at Dark Horse had planned to kill off Quinlan Vos at the end of the Clone Wars. And according to EW.com, George Lucas himself ordered that popular Jedi rogue Quinlan Vos survive the Star Wars Republic comics series. There you have it. George told the writers himself to keep Quinlan Vos alive, and there were rumors Lucas did this because he wanted Quinlan Vos to appear in the Star Wars Underworld show that was planned to be made at one point before being cancelled. Tell me once again, if George wanted Vos in the show, why did he have to ask the writers to keep him alive? Once again, wasn't the expanded universe always a non-canon alternate universe separate from his movies? If George wanted Vos alive for Underworld, he could have just ignored the writers killing off Vos since the Republic comics are non-canon anyways, according to your logic. In the new Jedi Order book series, the writers wanted to kill off Luke Skywalker at the end of the first book, Vector Prime. What did George Lucas do? Once more, he stepped in and said no, and didn't allow it. He had them kill off Chewbacca instead. Again, wasn't the expanded universe a non-canon, different alternate universe that wasn't part of the movies? Why would George care if a non-canon story that wasn't part of the movies universe kill off a character like Luke? I mean, isn't it non-canon? Luke would really not be dead since the EU is just a different non-canon separate universe, right? The Dark Horse comic writers wanted to do a story about Anakin Skywalker and the Clone Wars, but George Lucas, like the other times, vetoed and didn't let them do it. Instead, he let them explore an era a few thousand years before. Why would it matter if the story got made? Wasn't the expanded universe always a non-canon alternate universe? It wouldn't be part of George's universe since it isn't canon, right? If the comic had gotten written, it wouldn't have affected any prequel story since it's not part of George's universe. But guess what? For the millionth time, like the other examples, George did stop it. And sorry, it proves he did care. I know in your article you bring this point up, probably in response to what I said when I argued with you in the comment section of your video. Your response in the article is just basically, no. George doing stuff like that don't mean anything. It don't prove it was canon. So you basically admit you have no explanation, any legit explanation anyway, as to why George would do any of this stepping in and vetoing to prevent certain things in the EU from being done, if it was supposedly never canon to him. Sorry, Forcewave, actions speak louder than words. What do I mean by that exactly? Well, let's say for a minute, George actually was saying the EU wasn't ever canon in your Hump to Death Starlog magazine quote, which of course he really isn't. Someone or anyone can say something or claim they believe something, but their actions tell us otherwise. So even if George was saying the EU wasn't canon in your Holy Grail Starlog magazine quote, it wouldn't matter because George is showing that he did care for the EU and that it was canon, at least to a degree to him, by stepping in and preventing certain things from being done in the EU. He wouldn't be doing it if it was a non-canon alternate universe to his movies, because its supposed always non-canon status means whatever it does wouldn't matter because it's separate from his universe. And he can just ignore it according to your logic. But he doesn't. Lucas steps in so it can fit with his vision. If you can't answer this simple question as to why George Lucas would do any of this if it was supposedly not canon to him at all, then you immediately lost the argument on the expanded universe's canonicity. Something I've noticed about you, Forcewave, is that you dismiss all the quotes that go against your agenda as lesser sources. But then you go on to use what would count, according to your own definition and logic, as lesser sources to try and prove your points. That is the classic expanded universe hater tactic of selectively cherry-picking quotes and ignoring the other ones when it doesn't suit your agenda or view. It's also part of poor research, too. Let's examine all the quotes included in that list you ignore and dismissed, where Lucasfilm calls the expanded universe canon, plus all the other ones that aren't included in it that I found in my own research. But first, we'll start with the most recent post-2014 quotes where they say the EU was always canon or formally canon. In Star Wars Insider issue 172 from 2017, when describing reprints of the older Legends comics, they call these comics former canon, which means they were once canon. Star Wars Legends Epic Collection, The Rebellion Volume 2, is a mammoth, 488-page paperback reprinting of some of the stories published under the saga's former comic book canon. Now you could argue, well, they say comic book canon, not movie canon. So that doesn't prove it was ever canon. Again, hierarchy of canon, the comics were C-canon, which meant the movies had more canonical weight than the comics. But it didn't mean the comics were entirely not canon. On his social media page, Star Wars author Michael A. Stackpole in 2020 confirmed that the EU was once canon when he stated, "When we were writing EU stuff, it was canon. Now it's not. And we knew that was always a possibility. But if it gets picked up in a show, it's canon again. Bottom line, it's entertainment. If it entertains you and you like it, just be happy with that." On Star Wars Theories channel in an interview, author Matthew Stover says there were never any canon wars, and confirms the former canon status of the expanded universe pre-2014.
Questions. We spent a lot of time talking about Jedi and you know how he wanted the book to feel and stuff like that. And you know, in those days there was none of this kind of canon wars stuff that came about later on.
Right.
It was all canon. Everything published was canon.
Now let's look at the oldest quote I could find that defines what Star Wars canon is overall. And this was from Star Wars Insider, issue 23 in 1994. Gospel, or canon as we refer to it, includes the screenplays, the films, the radio dramas, and the novelizations. These works spin out of George Lucas's original stories. The rest are created by other writers. However, between us, we've read everything, and much of it is taken into account in the overall continuity. On StarWars.com in 2003, Subaru Stoney says what the only things that aren't canon in Star Wars are, like the tail stuff such as Skippy the Jedi Droid. Basically, everything except those items marked with an Infinity logo, i.e. the Star Wars Tales comics, is considered canon. I've said this before, but tell me one thing, Force Wave. If the expanded universe was never canon, then what was the point of even having infinities? And why didn't the expanded universe have the Infinities logo on it? I brought up this quote up before, but I'll just use it again. From Leland Chee's interview with TheWire.com in August of 2008. Lucas approves every important addition to the canon. The ambitious story beats contained in the new game, The Force Unleashed, were permitted only after he signed off, and spent hours talking to the developers about the relationship between Darth Vader and the Emperor. And for this next one, remember, the saga is the 6 movies. And this was in Star Wars Insider issue 93. The Force Unleashed is the official next chapter in the core Star Wars saga, with more story input from George Lucas than any previous game. From Star Wars Insider issue 101, the concept of an expanded universe certainly isn't unique to Star Wars. Many popular genre properties, from Star Trek to Alien, release spin-off tales that shed light on events not seen in the official narrative. But the Star Wars EU is unique both in its size and in the care with which its narrative is shepherded and organized. In Star Wars, the expanded universe is official, albeit on a slightly lower level. Because yes, the expanded universe was beta canon. That goes back to what I was saying about the films being more canon than the EU was, but with the whole hierarchy system. In Secrets of the Shadows of the Empire, Lucasfilm says, we have what we call canon, which is the screenplays, the novelizations, and other core works that are tied into the continuity. And then there are a lot of marginal things, like the old Marvel Comics series, that we don't try to work into the continuity when we're planning new projects. Even the LucasArts interactive games have a premise, a backstory with player characters that we're trying to tie into the overall continuity. It's sort of a godlike undertaking. We are creating this universe as we go along, but somebody has to keep his finger on all that has gone before. In 2012, on StarWars.com, Leland Chee states, everything outside of the films was collectively known as the expanded universe, serving as an extension of the same universe as the films. If something happened in a book or comic, it could potentially affect everything else happening in the universe. Any discrepancies that resulted would be resolved or retcon, short for retroactive continuity, i.e. changes from previously established continuity, across the board to try and keep some consistency. In Star Wars Insider issue 140, Lucasfilm says the general events of the cancelled Escape from Dagu novel starring Shaak Ti were canon. A novel, Escape from Dagu, by William C. Dietz, featuring Shaak Ti as its lead character, was planned but never released. The basic plot of the novel was Shaak Ti leading a prison revolt, and became canon when it was referenced in the official Star Wars Fact File 116 and the HoloNet news column that ran in Star Wars Insider number 66. In an interview with Danny Wallace on writing The Jedi Path, he states, officially everything in the Star Wars publishing universe is canon, though George Lucas retains creator privileges to override anything he wants. Lucasfilm employs a keeper of the holocron, namely Leland Chee, to keep it all straight. In this, Star Wars is unique from most other franchises. DC, for example, keeps the Batman comics separate from the Dark Knight movie and the Arkham Asylum video games. In the same interview on TheWire.com in August 2008, Leland Chee says, the thing about Star Wars is that there is one universe. Everyone wants to know stuff like, where did Mace Windu get that purple lightsaber? We want to establish that there's only one answer. In the same Wire.com interview, Howard Rothman says, we set parameters. It had to be an important extension of the continuity. And it had to have an internal integrity with the events portrayed in the films. Closely tending the canon was paying off with the fans. Essentially, all the new comic books, novels, and games were prequels and sequels of one another. In Star Wars Gamer number 6, Subaru Stoney states, canon refers to an authoritative list of books that the Lucas licensing editors consider an authentic part of the official Star Wars history. Our goal is to present a continuous and unified history of the Star Wars galaxy, insofar as that history does not conflict with or undermine the meaning of Mr. Lucas's Star Wars saga of films and screenplays. In Star Wars Insider issue 104, when referring to the three pillars that George Lucas describes, they state both the first and second pillars are treated as official Star Wars continuity. In July 1998, in the preface to the Star Wars Encyclopedia, Steve Sansweet confirmed once more what I said about the EU being canon, but the films having higher status and more canonical weight than everything else, and that fits with the use of their hierarchy of canon system when he says it's quasi-canon. Which brings us to the most often asked question. Just what is Star Wars canon and what is not? The one sure answer, the Star Wars Trilogy Special Edition. The three films themselves as executive produced, and in the case of Star Wars, written and directed by George Lucas, are canon. Coming in a close second, we have the authorized adaptation of the three films, the novels, radio dramas, and comics. After that, almost everything falls into the category of quasi-canon. and The Secrets of Shadows of the Empire, which I forgot to say it was from 1996, they state, to keep it all straight, there is the canon, a timeline of major events and lifespan of main characters prepared by the continuity editors of Lucasfilm and considered the in-house Bible of the Star Wars universe. On StarWars.com, in December 7th, 2005, Leland Chee states, if it's produced by one of the Lucas companies, it's official. In the Star Wars Galaxy Collector magazine #1 by Topps in 1998, Peter Schweihofer says, everything that is approved by Lucasfilm is official, no matter how small the contribution we've added to the well. Now let's go on to bring something very interesting about the Throne Trilogy. On the Heir to the Empire hardcover in 1991, it outright says, the saga continues. And remember, the saga is the 6 films. And then, also on the book, in 1991, it says, now for the first time, the authorized continuation of the legendary Star Wars saga, the most popular series of motion picture history, masterfully told by Hugo Award-winning author Timothy Zahn. And in Star Wars Insider issue 106 from 2008, Lucasfilm once again confirms the Thrawn trilogy was canon. Timothy Zahn's hardcover novel, Heir to the Empire, set 5 years after Return of the Jedi, appeared in bookstore windows in 1991 to thrill fans with an official continuation to their beloved movie trilogy. Now you can try and spam me the quote from the West End Games sourcebook that Pablo Hidalgo shared on his Twitter, the same man who is adamant to his followers not to believe anything he posts on his Twitter, to try and disprove any of what I said. But here's the thing, that West End Games guide came out before any kind of canon system was created back in the day, and it doesn't change the fact that they said it was officially what happened after Return of the Jedi more times than not. Speaking of Pablo Hidalgo, I brought this quote up before, but I'll read it again. In the Essentials Reader's Companion, Hidalgo admits the EU made the 501st Legion canon when it was mentioned in Survivor's Quest. Survivor's Quest was the first official Star Wars work to use the 501st name. The 501st began in 1997 as a fan organization of Stormtrooper and Imperial costumers, and has been a mainstay at Star Wars sci-fi and comic book conventions. Members are lauded by Lucasfilm for their charitable work, particularly with children's hospitals. Author Timothy Zahn had met fans from the 501st on his many comic book tours and convention appearances, and honored them by including them as part of the Star Wars canon. In the Star Wars A Visual Encyclopedia, they state, the definitive reference book of its time. It collects all the elements introduced into Star Wars canon by 2 decades of expanded universe publishing. Peter Schweihofer, in the Star Wars Adventure Journal, Introduction to Star Wars Tales of the Empire in 1997, states, this is perhaps the most exciting part of working on the journal, expanding the breadth of the Star Wars universe. Since it's a licensed publication, all the material becomes an official part of the continuity. And of course, Howard Rothman states, we've stuck to a very clear branding strategy for the past decade. This is Star Wars. Individual movies come and go, as do TV shows, video games, books. They all contribute to the lore of Star Wars. But in the end, it's one saga, and that saga is called Star Wars. We wanted to send a clear message to our fans that everything we do is part of that overall saga. The amount of times Lucasfilm called the EU official and canon on record is more than the amount of times and evidence you provided in your pathetic little article. Not counting your precious Starlog quote, the parallel universe quote, or maybe, yeah, I guess we'll have to discount the Splinter of the Mind's Eye quote, too, since he doesn't use the word canon at all in any of them. But Lucasfilm and other authors stated it was canon 27 plus times, and perhaps more in total ever since 1994. Discounting the Starlog and the Cinescape quote, you bring up what, like 3 measly quotes? The fact there is more instances in time that the EU is specifically called canon and official over and over again proves that it was. You can try and find more quotes that attempt to try and prove your agenda and throw them at me, but it won't change or overwrite the past quotes when they stated it was canon starting from the first moment they defined what Star Wars canon was in Star Wars Insider issue 23 in 1994. Also, don't give me that, but there was this Lucas licensing opinion, since I could also say that about Filoni and Hidalgo's quotes you try and bring up. You can't just ignore when his own company over and over again calls it canon and official. Their word counts. In the end, if you believe the Starlog or Cinescape quote says the EU was never canon to George, your own logic would dictate that none of the Star Wars material produced after the EU getting axed in 2014 until today under the Disney regime is canon either. A New Dawn isn't canon to George, the Dr. Aphra stories aren't canon to him, Solo isn't canon to him, Disney's sequel trilogy isn't canon to him, The Mandalorian isn't canon to him, Rebels isn't canon to Lucas, Jedi Fallen Order as well, and on and on and on for everything in the new canon. Not saying that to bash these pieces of Star Wars media, as some of these stories I listed in the new canon here are actually quite decent. It's funny and shows your cherry-picking double standards when you acknowledge when current Lucasfilm says all the new non-movie material post-2014 is canon, but when the same company ever since 1994 and various times since, even post-2014, says the expanded universe was canon, you outright and deliberately ignore it and dismiss that evidence as lesser sources simply because it doesn't agree with your agenda. Plus your cherry-picking of Hidalgo and Leland Chi quotes and thinking it somehow automatically overwrites their past statements and quotes from a lying cowboy hat-wearing fool who goes against George's wishes. It's all the showing of your hypocrisy. I know you could argue back to me, but George isn't in charge anymore, so that's why I accept when they say the new stuff is canon. Again, George never says the word canon in any of the quotes you provided, and you could argue he never really did talk about the subject of Star Wars in canon. But his company and employees who worked there at Lucasfilm did. While he may be the creator, George's word is unreliable to try and use to prove the EU was supposedly never canon, since he is a man who constantly contradicts himself. And Leland Chi confirmed this. The EU was canon. It's just that the movies had higher status and more weight when it came to canon than every other piece of Star Wars media. The hierarchy of canon I brought up earlier proves this. And having less canonical weight didn't mean the EU was entirely not canon at all, though, since there is an N-canon category separate from what the EU was under. And once again, 98% of the expanded universe is not listed under this N-canon tier. If at the very least you can't at least admit this, then I have nothing more to say, because I'd be arguing with a stubborn brick wall at this point. And at this point, if you and all the other EU haters just continue to insist that the expanded universe was never canon, then you're all on the same level of intelligence and stubbornness as flat earthers. And it's like trying to convince them that the earth is round and they continue to insist that it's flat even after you take them out into space. And I've provided you with all the evidence that it was canon. And at this point, it's whether or not you choose to accept the facts. You can also continue to plug your ears and tell me, no, I'm just going to adamantly hold on to my and I'll be all quotes and not watch your video response because I stubbornly refuse to be proven wrong or argue on it. I'm right. End of story. If you do that, you are basically admitting that you have no legit response to this video and you've lost the argument. It would also show your lack of maturity and and intelligence, especially with the amount of evidence I've provided in my response. If you still insist the expanded universe was never official canon in Star Wars, my final words regarding that are...
Well, that's your opinion, man.
My final advice to you, Force Wave, is to go take a writing class to learn to write better articles than this poorly written stinker you scrambled together. So anyways, if any of my viewers have any other thoughts or things I should add I missed out on bringing up, or didn't include and think I should have, let me know in the comments section and post it. Also, make sure to link this video to any Starlog quote humpers or EU haters out there so they can be schooled if they try to link you this article I'm debunking. Hope you enjoyed the video.